The theatre of the absurd was a literary movement that began in Europe in the 1960s. This was a European movement that started as a result of various changes in society, political maneuvers, the debacle of the Second and the First World Wars, then the social upheaval as a result of such changes, and of course, the scientific developments that were one after the other changing the national and the global perspective of the people. The theatre of the absurd is a movement which is existentialism. In another word, it is not related to so much as to any particular doctrine, but it is related to the theory of existentialism and derives its inspiration from such other movements like surrealism, experimental art movements like expressionism and impressionism, and is a combination of factors that showed the mindset of Europe after the wars. Basically, theatre of the absurd is a term which has been coined by Martin Esslin in his most seminal book, in which he tries to compare and to bring together various writers who at different climes and different countries were practicing the idea of man's existence as essentially absurd. Man's living in an absurd universe. This absurdity, which is ingrained in man's existence, was a concept which was not new. Sartre, Camus, Kafka, all European writers, they had at various points of time stressed the absurdity in man's existence. In fact, according to Sartre, man's existence is by its very nature absurd. There are very minor differences between the theatre of the absurd writers, but on the whole they share some very broad common characteristics. According to Kafka, man's condition is neither tragic nor depressing. Man's condition is to be defined by absurdity. Camus' The Outsider, a very important fiction, a very important novel, shows the hero having no feelings. He does not have a record of events which are happening in his life. In fact, he has, somehow, overreached in the sense that he stops articulating the normal kind of feelings and expressions which we can expect of human beings. This is because man in an absurd universe, if he comes to understand his position, then he will stop trying to achieve his ends. The absurd universe paradigm is that a character who is living in an absurd universe must realize that all his actions are futile. The kind of attempt that man makes to achieve his ends are not met with success, they are not met with acclaim, they are bound to fail, and perennially we are doomed to failure. All motives, all expressions of trying to achieve something, of attempting to gain something, ultimately lands one in frustration, and this is believed to be the prime watchword of the theatre of the absurd writers, and especially playwrights, because this was a movement in drama. One must also remember that there are, as I said, some broad characteristics. Absurdist writers from all over the globe, they share certain common features. One important feature of absurdist writing is that the absurdist playwrights do not abide by the unities of time, place, and action in their works. They also do not abide by the linear chronological sequence of plays. They don't abide by the characters, a particular categorization of characters as good, bad, impartial, partial, a semblance of a real character. The characters can be dream states, they can be superhumans, they can be surreal in their impact, and therefore the normal expectation of the audience is frustrated. So we have no recognizable characters, with of course exceptions in different playwrights. If we do have normal characters, they are subject to abnormal behavior by their own psychic drives and by their own situations that have made them truly absurd in the true sense of the term. And also we see the technical aspect of this kind of a movement is that in writing, in the playwright's dramas, we see that there is no language which can provide us with any viable meaning. Therefore, communication at one level fails. Communication fails in the sense is that the dramas all have characters communicating, but sometimes the characters communicate only through, an incoherent bubble. They just go on, making sounds which have no particular relation to language. So this aspect of making sound, just noise, without any identifiable human language, is something which is another very, very important aspect of the theatre of the absurd. We see that in many plays. For example, Ionesco's famous play, The Chairs, we see how the professor who is supposed to deliver a lecture goes on with his lecture, which is nothing but, a jumbled sequence of syllables which are actually meaningless. And how these meaningless syllables, they cannot bring a language alive. What does it mean? There is communication, so is really useless. In many other places, in many other plays, we see, for example, in Waiting for Godot, the speech of Lucky when he is finally allowed to speak, he speaks, he goes on muttering things which become nonsensical. So nonsensical dialogue with cliches, dialogue with word games, cliches, nonsense speaking, and speech which has no form of an identifiable language paradigm are common traits of the theatre of the absurd. So one of the most important aspects of the theatre of the absurd is that it is the failure of language to communicate. In fact, the failure of human beings to communicate with each other on the basis of language. In fact, non-linguistic symbols, in other words, the silent symbols sometimes are more effective in the theatre of the absurd. That's why we can say that, and it has often been said, that the theatre of the absurd is a set of concrete stage images. It is a set of concrete stage images which delivers the message in a play, if there is a message at all. In most of the plays of the theatre of the absurd, we see that the plays don't offer us any conclusions. Once again, a very important aspect of the theatre of the absurd dramas. And if they do offer us a conclusion, then it has to be distilled by the audience. They are not satisfied at the end. There is no poetic justice. And of course, they don't abide by the normal categorizations of plot, whether it is a tragedy, it is a comedy, or whether it is meant to be, any kind of, a monologue. So in certain respects, it is, an intermixture of genres. It is an intermixture of genres in the sense that tragicomic elements, the comic, the scholarly, the normal, the abnormal, the dream state, the hallucinatory state, the characteristics of the id in Freudian terms, and the characteristics of the ego and the superego, they can all coalesce, they can all combine and come together in a single setting, in a single, moment of drama. Also, we do not have very recognizable, very connected settings. The settings can be weird, it can be out of space, it can be something which is totally dreamlike, and so the same goes for the characters, the same goes for their speeches. Again, motivations of characters are totally unwarranted. They are totally out of sync with our normal human expectations. Another very, very important and vital aspect of the theatre of the absurd is that motivations are totally unpredictable. And this is how you see the playwrights frustrate our ideas about the normal norms, the normal expectations, and the normal workings of society. Many critics often label the theatre of the absurd as shock art. This is a term, shock art within quotation. This is a term which is in fact important because it shocks the audience out of their complacency. It is a term which actually shocks the audience in the sense that the audience will feel restless after watching a play of the theatre of the absurd. Having said this about the nature and the kind and quality of plays that the theatre of the absurd handles, I will just tell you another very important, core, which can be correlated, a very important idea related to the theatre of the absurd, which comes out in Albert Camus' 1942 essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. Now, Sisyphus was a legendary character, he was a mythical character, and he was punished by the gods. And in this punishment, Sisyphus had to carry a heavy load, a stone, a very big, enormously huge and heavy stone up the hill. And no longer had he carried it up the hill with great energy and with great force, the stone would come down rolling and he would again have to make it reach on top of the hill. Now, this is a perennially troublesome, a perennially harrowing, a very difficult and an unsurmountable kind of an effort which he had to put and which he had to, through which he had to make the stone go up the hill every time it fell down from its position. Now, this myth of Sisyphus shows this motive, this visual image of Sisyphus, which is there in the slide. You see in one of the slides it is there, shows how futile man's action is. So man's action is basically futile, not because of the attempt he makes, but because there is no outcome of the effect, or there is no outcome of the effort that he puts on his part. So according to this myth, according to this essay of Camus, we see that man's action is futile. There is another very important quote. I am not narrating the quote, but in short, in a gist form, it is that man has been cut off from his metaphysical, psychological and spiritual roots. He has no claims to his metaphysical identity, to his psychological identity, no control over his spiritual domain, and therefore, in a meaningless universe, he is not accorded any kind of meaning, either for himself, for his actions, and neither can his actions be categorized as good and bad. They can be both good and bad. I will talk shortly again of having said so much about the qualities, the in general and the broader categories and qualities of the absurdist writers. I would very shortly try to tell you about the major absurdist writers. There were many absurdist writers, but one by one I will try to enumerate their basic traits. When we come to Beckett, as your topic is how does Waiting for Godot relate to the theatre of the absurd? When we come to Beckett, we see that we have combinations, we have pairs of, dual characters or double characters who come together and who exist in pairs. They may be interdependent, or they may, try to give us something through their, innate pairing, the quality of innate pairing, which we have in Waiting for Godot also through the characters of Vladimir and Estragon, Gogo, Didi, and of course through the characters of Pozo and Lucky. We also have similar, partner characters who come in pairs in other plays, of course. For example, Nell and Nag, then we have Ham and Clove, you see. And in other, Beckett's dramas, we have these characters in pairs, and we have these essential binaries projected through characters in pairs, which means one character can represent the spiritual, the other character can represent the physical. One character can represent the id, while the other character can represent the ego, or they may be alter egos of each other. They may, complement their acting with each other. One character complements his own acting with the other. So this is the use, this is normally found in Beckett. One very particular play which doesn't make use of any words as such. There is no written language. It's only, the action shown on stage without any dialogue is Act Without Words. Beckett's very famous play, Act Without Words, which doesn't have any dialogue form. Here, the theatre of the absurd, a particular definition for this play alone would be, it is a series of stage images, a concrete set of visual images which gives you the desired impact. When we come to Ionesco, we see that Ionesco's plays doesn't have the strange out-of-space setting that Beckett's surreal plays seem to have. In most of Beckett's plays, in fact, even in Waiting for Godot, you have a scenario, an empty road with only a single tree, which looks very surreal in its impact. But you see, in Ionesco, a comparative study would reveal that Ionesco's dramas have normal settings. For example, in the bald soprano or in the bald prima donna, we have that kind of a normal British drawing room scenario. In the lesson, we have a normal study. And once again, if you see the play The Rhinoceros, we have a typical, street scene, a cafe scene, the normal kind of scenario. But in spite of the fact that the settings are normal in Ionesco, we see that the characters aren't. If you see a play like Rhinoceros, where it was written to, critique the fascist regime, we see how the human characters turn to become rhinoceroses. We also see other plays. We can see plays by Jean Genet, and we see that in Jean Genet, it is the kind of characters' psychological predilections which they are fighting against. They are fighting against their own self-centered egoism. And therein we have very famous plays by Jean Genet like The Maids. We have very famous play like something like The Blacks, where the Blacks, one of the characters in the play, The Black, makes it clear that, this is his attempt to kind of dislodge communication, to kind of end communication, to not to communicate through communication. So a very, very potent remark in the play. When we come to Pinter, Harold Pinter, another very important exponent of the theatre of the absurd, we can see that Pinter's plays, they have the broader, setting, the broader kind of realism. In fact, Pinter uses realism to refute realism. So Pinter's plays are very, apparently they seem to be very realistic, but they aren't so far as theme and so far as subject matter is concerned. So you see, Pinter is a genre apart. He has been called Pinterest. He is a playwright of the theatre of the absurd, but because of his peculiar characteristics, he has been called Pinterest. Same for Adamov. Adamov's characters also, they try to assert themselves. In the midst of everybody, they try to expose themselves, but then they land up in a total failure of communication. In Edward Albee, who is an American absurdist writer, we see that Edward Albee's plays also try to hint at this non-communicable aspect of human existence, how characters cannot relate to each other, they cannot communicate through each other, either through symbols, both verbal symbols and both non-verbal symbols. So symbols, whether they are verbal or non-verbal, they don't help in communication. So each different artists of the theatre of the absurd, they have their own peculiarities, but they fall under the same broad umbrella of the theatre of the absurd, and they abide by a few characteristics which I have already told you. Winding up the Waiting for Godot as a play of the theatre of the absurd, I would just tell you that when it was projected on stage, when it was ultimately produced in 1953, it created a sensation. This was an iconoclastic, a groundbreaking play, because earlier there had been no such plays, and this was the starting point. Waiting for Godot was the starting point in theatres for the plays of the absurdist tradition to be put on stage. You see, we have a surreal, half surreal, out of space, very unconventional setting, an open road with a bleak, empty tree with only a few leaves in the second act and no leaves at all in the first act. Then once again, the characters are two tramps. The two acts are a repetition. They are repeated again and again. So there is nothing which happens which is new. Now, nothing ever happens is another catchword for the theatre of the absurd. That is, there is no result, as I said earlier. This is one of the main theoretical paradigms of the theatre of the absurd, that we do not arrive at any results. Same for Waiting for Godot. The two characters, the two tramps, Vladimir and Estragon, they go on waiting for Godot, but Godot never arrives. There is a boy messenger who comes and delivers the message that Godot is about to arrive tomorrow, but then we see that there is no surety about Godot. Again, we have two characters, Pozo and Lucky, who are also very, surreal characters from dream states. You see, Pozo has a rope through which he controls Lucky. Lucky is just like an animal. He makes Lucky do all his, errands. And so these characters who are inextricably linked to each other by them being partners of each other as characters who are paired with each other. The play has that kind of nonsensible dialogue. It has that kind of, cliched dialogue. It has that kind of repetition in itself. It has the typical, characteristics of a theatre of the absurd drama. I would like to conclude by saying that Beckett is a minimalist playwright. He is a playwright who uses minimal stage sets, who uses minimal dialogue, who uses minimal characters, and of course minimal kind of effects, scenic effects, to show and put his plays across to the audience. Not like other dramas, not like other dramatists who want an elaborate stage setting, or maybe not like Pinter who has an elaborate dialogue. Beckett is seriously a minimalist playwright, and he's also an innovator, because his plays, most of his plays, I've talked about a play without dialogue, act without words, and in other plays, for example, Crapps's Last Tape, here an old character only listens to his tape, a tape recorder that gives his previous life, his life led in young times, through the medium of words. And when the tape comes to an end, it comes so very nicely that we realize that Crapp has really come to the end of his life. So you see how different plays with different, orientations, they give you various aspects of the theatre of the absurd. Beckett, in his minimalism in Waiting for Godot, in the figure of the two trams, in the very basis, the catchword of the play that nothing ever happens, and in the very fact that really nothing ever happens in the play, and instead of the 2-act structure, it could well have been a 4-act structure, but then also nothing would have happened, because the play is just a repetition in the second act with a few minor inputs. So with all these characteristics, with all the kind of language that we have, minimal language, the language expressed through nonsensical speech, half words, etc., we realize that it is a classic example of the theatre of the absurd.